All right, I'm just going to type a note here for everybody to um, sign in when they come on board. All right, cool. So I'm going to get started. We are on chapter 9, and this is called The Heart of Darkness. So we're going to kind of get into the meat of the book at this point. We talked about originally how Japan basically went all over the Pacific, stole everything, how they hid it between the royal palace and the Philippines. And we talked briefly about them setting up 3 funds to basically hide the gold. And that basically MacArthur knew all about this and was in many ways a party to it. So we start off this chapter with having lost control of the M Fund, because we talked about that, M as in Michael, just the initial. In 1960, when it was given away by Vice President Nixon in exchange for Tokyo's secretly laundering money back to him to run for president in 1960 against Kennedy. Because keep in mind, at this time, President Nixon is the vice president under President Eisenhower. So he's running to be president, and for all practical purposes, that should have been a shoo-in for him. However, especially with all of the gold being cycled back to him. But he lost, Kennedy won. And for 40 years since then, the M Fund has remained the illicit secret toy of at least 7 Liberal Democratic Party politicians in Tokyo. So basically, they just use the money to keep themselves in perpetual power in Tokyo. Nixon effectively gave them the ultimate secret weapon, a bottomless black bag of gold and other antiquities. President Eisenhower was going to Tokyo to conclude revisions to the mutual security treatment, but his trip got canceled after violent protests outbroke in Japan. So Prime Minister Nobusuke flew to Washington, where the security treaty negotiations were conducted with Vice President Nixon. Nixon was obsessed by his craving to become president and was willing to turn over control of the M Fund and he also promised to return Okinawa, which is a strategic U.S. military base, which is part of Japan, in return for kickbacks to his campaign fund. Kishi, K-I-S-H-I, was an indicted war criminal and a key figure in the wartime regime, basically selling drugs, munitions, and slave labor. And he basically gained personal control of the M Fund when it was transferred back to Japan. According to Takano Hajime and other well-informed sources, Nixon justified the deal with the dubious excuse that Tokyo needed an emergency covert source of money in the event that war broke out in Asia. What? In 1960? Sure. So Keep in mind that the Constitution of Japan at the time prevented it from even having an army. So basically, the only use they would have for that kind of money is illicit covert activity, both in and out of Japan. In 1960, the M Fund was said to have had an asset base of about $35 billion with a B. How much of this Kishi agreed to kick back to Nixon is an unknown. Nixon did not turn the M Fund over to the government of Japan, but to Prime Minister Kishi personally, putting the lie to his grandiose justifications. So, in other words, if it was to benefit Japan as a pretext to prepare them against war, it would have been turned over to the state. But instead, he basically signed over trusteeship to a person who happened to occupy the prime minister's position at the time. And Kishi also controlled the political party that was the fascist oriented, as they refer to it in here, the right, the same one that the CIA basically toppled all the governments to put in charge. That's who was in charge and who was going to get possession of this fund to perpetuate them being controlled by the CIA and the US government. It goes without saying that they never used it for the designated purpose, instead turning it over for a private source of personal enrichment. Nixon made several bargains like this. There was a book written, The Secret World of Richard Nixon, by Anthony Summers, which basically illustrated his desire to perpetually advance his political career. And the fact that they point out in that book, The Secret World of Richard Nixon, that Nixon made financial deals with Meyer Lansky and other underworld crime figures. In another book, The Case Against Henry Kissinger, in Harper Magazine, it was arguing that Nixon and Kissinger secretly manipulated American policy for their own personal ends in violation of the US Constitution. Nixon's M Fund giveaway was not the end of the story. Under the LDP, which is their political party that's ran Japan for all of this time, the M Fund spawned a number of exotic financial instruments that were basically put through global financial markets like a virus. Investors or their attorneys would have been snared in amazing international sting operations and charged with negotiating fraudulent instruments ending in wrongful convictions and prison sentences. It is now painfully obvious that some of these victims were holding authentic paper and only were stung to shield the Japanese government from being exposed of having this fund. How did Nixon's dirty deal lead to such a scandalous impasse decades later? To know that, we must see what happened when the M Fund changed hands. Until Nixon interfered, the M Fund was controlled and administered by a small group of Americans in Tokyo, close to MacArthur. In 1950, when the Korean War started, most of the US forces in Japan was sent to Korea, creating a security vacuum. Because the post-war constitution prohibited setting up an army, the M Fund was used to create what is characterized as a self-defense force. When the occupation ended in 1952, Washington and Tokyo concluded their joint security treaty. Administration of the M Fund shifted to dual control staffed by the US Embassy's CIA personnel and their Japanese counterpart. Basically weighed in the American favor, though. The Yotsuya Fund, YOTSUYA Fund, and the Keenan Fund, which we talked about last chapter, were folded into make a single fund called the M Fund. The M Fund's asset base was being invested in Japanese industry and finance, and the returns were used for political purposes. The M Fund Council interfered vigorously to keep Japan's government, industry, and society under tight control and friendly to the US. That meant blocking, undermining Japanese individuals or groups who wished to liberalize Japan's politics or operate in competition to any of the current industries. It basically put Japan's society in a figurative straitjacket. In 1956, the Eisenhower administration labored long and hard to put Kishi in charge and then keep him there. So the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, which again has been in charge of Japan basically the entire time since World War II. This is the same Kishi who had been a member of the hardcore ruling clique in Manchuria, and he was up there with the General Tojo Kaideki and Noki, who we talked about a long time ago in one of the very first chapters. And they were in charge of the narcotic monopoly up in the northern part of China. So Kishi is a drug dealer who becomes prime minister in a nutshell. Kishi also had signed the Japanese declaration of war against America in 1941. During World War II, he was the vice minister of munitions and commerce and industry, actively involved in slave labor, using all of those people who were denied compensation based on the John Foster Dulles Treaty afterwards. He protected all of these people that we're talking about that are basically criminals. He made a personal fortune in side deals during this time. Following Japan's surrender, he was one of the most prominent indicted war criminals, where he was a cellmate with Kodama. In 1948, when his release from prison was purchased by Kodama, Kishi began organizing the financial base of the Liberal Democratic Party, using Kodama's black gold and injections of the M Fund cash. So Kishi was basically groomed to be the American guy that was going to interface with all of our CIA people and members such as Averell Harriman's group at the American Council for Japan. They worked tirelessly to improve Kishi's image, tutor him in English, and taught him how to drink scotch. You know, you got to have your priorities correct. Kishi was the America's only bet left in Japan. This was all done covertly with black money. Washington was using the M Fund to replace one prime minister with another. In 1956, elections results were in, and Kishi was trumped by rival LDP faction leader Tanzan, Tanzan, regarded as the least pro-American leader of the LDP party. Ishibashi Tanzan had won because Washington had paid off Kishi's supporters, but had not given enough to his opponents. Annoyed, President Eisenhower personally authorized the CIA to destroy Ishibashi and put Kishi at the head of the party. This meant paying very large bribes to all factions to shift their support to Kishi. In February 57, after an extraordinary amount of grunting and snorting behind the folding screen, Kishi at last replaced Ishibashi as the leader and was named prime minister. Kashi then took over from Kadama as America's favorite war criminal. Now, keep in mind, because this is so important, we're hearing kind of the down and dirty behind the scenes of what has happened all over the world with the CIA. This is a very well researched and corroborated accounting of what went on behind the scenes in Japan. So we didn't get this level of detail in most of the other books that we've reviewed, but it's important to understand that anytime the will of the people in these countries that offered up someone that was not as pro-American as the American government decided they wanted, they would undermine them. And it was done at all costs to kill people, to blow things up, create domestic terror events using Gladio operators. It didn't matter. No one was allowed to elect who they wanted. No one, anywhere. If they tried and was initially successful, that person would be overthrown, assassinated, whatever it took, boiled in acid, as we found out. So Kishi reasserted his loyalty to America's Cold War strategy, limited contact with China, and instead focused on Japanese economic attention in their business dealings with America. Kishi's term as prime minister was a 3-year tour. The Democratic Party over there received $10 million each year directly from the CIA, chiefly from the M Fund. A guy by the name of Alfred C. Ulmer, U-L-M-E-R, Jr. We've come across him several times in Operation Gladio as well. The CIA officer who controlled the M Fund and many other operations in Japan from 55 to 58 said, quote, "We financed them," unquote, because the CIA, quote, "depended on the Democratic Party for information," unquote. When the party's coffers were depleted by the monumental effort to get Kishi named prime minister, Finance Minister Sato, Kishi's brother, of course, appealed to Ambassador Douglas MacArthur II, which was the general's nephew. Isn't that convenient? And we see that a lot. You know, Churchill's son, Roosevelt's son, Thatcher's son, they all have been involved in the CIA Gladio garbage. So the finance minister of Japan approaches the ambassador with his hand out for more secret money. In 1958, Ambassador MacArthur wrote to the Department of State providing details of the request. Sato asked, quote, "Sato asked if it would not be possible for the U.S. to supply financial funds to aid the forces in this constant struggle against communism. This did not come as a surprise to us since he suggested the same idea last year," unquote. This put the ball in Nixon's court. When Nixon renegotiated the Mutual Security Treaty in 59 and 60, he not only gave Kishi the M Fund, he also promised that when he became president, he would give Okinawa back to Japan while retaining military base rights there. According to sources close to the former prime minister, Tanaka, Nixon told Kishi that if Japan would assist him in becoming president, he would see to it that the U.S. withdrew its role in managing the M Fund, and upon it being cleared, Nixon would return Okinawa to Japan, unquote. According to the meeting, the revision of the security treaty in 1960, the M Fund was turned over to Kishi. In 73, when Nixon at last was elected president, he returned Okinawa to Japan, with us still having the basing rights. The White House National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, later remarked that the Okinawa transfer had puzzled him. In 1973, when Nixon gave Okinawa back to Japan, I was following this very closely. Now, in light of Nixon's M fund deal, it makes all the sense in the world to me. He's basically quoted as saying, the revised Joint Security Treaty was so unpopular that Kishi immediately lost control of his cabinet and had to resign as prime minister. Only a matter of months after giving him control of the M fund, America lost much of the leverage it had gained with the huge bribe. Nixon may not have got all the kickbacks he expected. Years later, when the chance came to take America off the gold standard, weakening the dollar and strengthening the yen, making Japanese exports more expensive, Nixon laughed that he was sticking it to the Japanese. Ha ha ha. Kishi remained as the Liberal Democratic Party kingmaker behind the scenes because he had all the money. Virtually every prime minister in Japan since then had been picked by the clique controlling the M fund because they had the most inducement to pass around. Sarcastically called the Magnificent Seven, the clique included Prime Ministers Kishi, Tanaka, Kakawi, Takeshita, Nakazone, another semi-Kishi, Kiichi, Deputy Prime Minister Gotoda, and a Vice President, Kanemaru. Compared to the dynastic families and financial shoguns, these were only politicians greasing the wheels. They were in unrivaled positions to steer Japanese economy, politics, and government at every level without any accountability to the Japanese people. Tanaka was the most cleverest of the bunch. He had acquired personal control of the M fund from Kishi and provided rare keyhole view of the money politics in Japan. One of Kishi's first acts when Nixon gave him the fund was to help himself to $3 billion. This was nearly 10% of the fund's total assets in 1960. Although he was no longer prime minister, Kishi arranged the selection of Tanaka, a minister of finance, in the new Ikeda administration, and in the next administration, headed by Kishi's brother, Prime Minister Sato Isaku. As a high school dropout, Tanaka hardly seemed qualified to lead the Ministry of Finance, but he had other qualifications, which included charm and financial scams. As a young draftsman in an architectural firm, he became a protege of a guy by the name of Viscount Okachi Masatatushi. I love these names. He was a friend of Kishi and boss of a conglomerate called Riken Group, which basically took advantages of all of the U.S. military contracts that were being let to rebuild Japan. Riken was at the center of Japan's unsuccessful attempt to create an atom bomb. The Viscount set up Tanaka for life by arranging for him to marry a rich divorcee. Tanaka inherited her father's construction company. While most Japanese were losing everything to firebombing, Tanaka won vast inflated military contracts. This is pre-war, becoming one of Japan's wartime millionaires. Immediately before the surrender, he was paid $73 million to transfer a piston ring factory to Korea to put it out of the range of the American bombers. He did not move the factory, but he took the money and put it into gold and never had to account for it at all. This windfall he contributed to, some of it he contributed to the Liberal Party, buying himself a seat in what they refer to as the Diet, which is like our Congress. Kishi became prime minister of the merged Liberal Democrat Party in 1957. He appointed Tanaka as Minister of Post. Tanaka boasted that he bought this first cabinet position for 3 million yen. Way to go. Japan's postal system was ripe for robbing or embezzling because it included a national bank with postal accounts for millions of citizens. Tanaka showed real genius by finding ways to dip into the savings of ordinary people, like pickpocketing from the government. Kishi turned over the M Fund to Tanaka and put him in charge of the finance ministry. Tanaka took personal control of all central government subsidies for government, all national expenditures for public work, totaling over $400 billion each year, in addition to controlling the M money at the Ministry of Finance. He also had the Bank of Japan, and Tanaka was able to loot both private citizens and the national treasury at the same time, moving more billions into the M Fund and out of the hands of the government with money that belonged to the citizens. He had basically also bought off everybody that worked in the finance industry by giving them the Ministry of Finance, by giving them some of this black money to keep their mouths shut. It cost about $4 million to get elected to the Japanese Diet, where a member's annual salary is $200,000. Sounds like a Nancy Pelosi deal, right? So you're paying somebody off to get the seat, and then you get paid $200,000. So obviously that seat's worth a lot more money than what your government salary is. So it says 100 MPs show up monthly to constituents' events like weddings, funerals, and things like that. And the MP was expected to make a traditional gift of congratulations or condolences, which cost roughly about $6,000 a month. So an MP could not stay afloat without support, which is where the M Fund came in. And it said that the Liberal Democratic Party was founded in 1950s. It had to spend around $10 trillion with a T in bribes, patronage to remain in power. So Tanaka could not relax. He had to enlarge the M Fund asset base to generate the interest needed to maintain this injection of new cash. It was not enough to raid the national treasury. They used rigged bidding for construction industries. They used kickbacks. Tanaka created government construction bond issues without approval. These bonds were sold at a discount to wealthy cronies who they were simply given away in exchange for secret donations to the M Fund. When the bonds matured, cronies agreed to return most of the proceeds to Tanaka and then keep the money. Then he would keep the money for his own use or add it to the M Fund. So welcome, Trauma Mama. Tanaka also came up with a scheme to sell real estate confiscated during the war from enemy aliens, like the ones that they killed. You know, they went around through all of the villages and took anyone that was not ethnic Japanese and made them a slave. And so they basically then came back around and stole all of their real estate and sold it off. Let's see. Oh, and that was allowed in John Foster Dulles' treaty too. Tanaka discovered that they were basically worth a gold mine. So he ended up selling 1,681 of those properties at ridiculously low amounts to his buddies. And let's see, it generated a profit of about, when his cronies resold them years later on the open market, it generated to them about $22 billion. Much of which went back to Tanaka as kickbacks for the scheme. But of course, they got to skim off the top. Some of this he put in his offshore account, some to the M Fund. And the most important source for Tanaka's private Bank of Japan was the National Social Welfare Association. He set that up in 1964. The title of it makes it a joke because it had nothing to do with the welfare of the citizens. It existed only for the welfare of him and his friends. As a matter of fact, they jokingly called it the Tanaka Club. And he actually hosted the meetings in his home. In U.S. court testimony and copies of original Japanese documents that this author has on a CD, the original membership of the club was 17 people. Eventually, it grew to over 30, but they were all men that made their fortune in banking, commerce, real estate development, speculation, construction, and industrialists. Although names may ring a bell, two others are well known worldwide. One is the Sumi Senji family holdings, to include national and international hotels, railways, resorts, and department stores among global finance moguls, and the and I guess, so they're like the Japanese equivalent of the Rockefellers. The other one was Osana Kenji, one of Japan's richest men and chairman of the Kokumin Bank, nicknamed the Monster for his ruthless business tactics. My husband has a friend that when he starts texting, they like text every 5 seconds. So I'm going to turn this off so I don't have to hear it. Okay, so he's named the Monster because of his business tactics. The guy that's the richest man in Japan. He actually happens to be Korean. He made a fortune during the war selling auto parts to the military. At the surrender, Osano was involved in hiding the Imperial Army's large stockpiles and profiteering by selling them off on the black market. He basically was the thrift store for the Japanese government. Tanaka Osario Trading House was the name of the venue that he did this in the 1970s, having secured Tanaka's approval to move gigantic sums overseas. When most Japanese were forbidden to do so, Osana bought many Waikiki beach hotels and made himself the godfather of the Japanese-Korean mafia in Hawaii, which then extended its tentacles into the West Coast and many tourism fronts in California. Tanaka's biggest scam was to contrive government bonds because he had them issued by the Ministry of Finance. Then they were technically legitimate with or without Diet approval. Each had a very big face value amount ranging from like 10 billion yen to sometimes 50 billion, which would have been around 50 million to 250 million at the time, but now worth obviously much more than that. These bonds were purchased by core Tanaka club members using their own money. The black money from the M Fund, or black money from the M Fund, sorry about that. The designated payees, most were serving only as straw men for Tanaka. This allowed him to park very large, this is money laundering, by the way, amounts of illicit funds secured via a form of government bonds. Interest paid on these bonds and profits at their maturity were to be kicked back directly to Tanaka or split between Tanaka and the bondholders. These documents, some labeled top secret or very important, bore the personal seal of Tanaka, Takasone, Takashita, and basically proving the arrangements were endorsed by the Ministry of Defense, by the leadership of the Liberal Democratic Party, and by top management members of the bank that they were originally issued on. For a while, the scam worked flawlessly. In running the M Fund, Tanaka was assisted by several people. Basically, all of them became very rich. Before his health required him to relinquish control of the M Fund in 1986, Tanaka is thought to have helped himself to about $30 billion through these funds and arrangements. The Japanese sources say he invested offshore through Union Bank Swiss, UBS, in Switzerland, as a trust fund to safeguard his family for future generations. Tanaka's daughter briefly served as Japan's foreign minister. And what's interesting about this is many of these instances come back to UBS. So we go through all of these other banks that are like the temporary banks, the Castle Banks, the Nugent Hand Bank down in Australia, the BCCI Bank in Pakistan. But a couple, the Deutsche Bank in Germany and UBS in Switzerland, are kind of like the long poles in the tent as the money laundering hubs. So another guy, Gotoda, was discovered by Tanaka and basically became an assistant to him. And after graduating from Tokyo's Imperial University in 1939, Totoda entered the Secret Service associated with Golden Lily, which is the ensconcing of all of the antiquities and hiding them. And he rose to be the chief of the national police. When Tanaka became prime minister, he chose him as his deputy chief cabinet secretary, the most important bureaucratic post in the cabinet. As a former secret policeman, head of the national police, he was one of the most feared men in the country. And that's what appealed to Tanaka. So he basically, this head of security, used a guy by the name of Kanemaru. Kanemaru became basically like their bagman, and he began distributing bribes and kickbacks from the M Fund and basically ranked as the LDP's political fixer, kind of like John Podesta. Although elected to the Diet 12 times, he never showed up there. He just paid for a seat. So Tanaka basically, let's see, enemies began to leak information about his, in 1972, about his improprieties, Tanaka's, that is. Investigative journalists bravely published an expose on his corruption. The ensuing scandal forced Tanaka to claim ill health and step down from being the prime minister, but he was never prosecuted. And the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations in 1976 had a committee hearing into a Lockheed bribery scandal, where it was emerged that Tanaka was one of the government officials that Lockheed had bribed to win sales of a new plane to the Nippon Airways, Nippon, however you pronounce that. Although the money came from Lockheed, it was conveyed by the CIA through Godfather Kodama. still on the agency's payroll, who had arranged for Japan to buy 230 Lockheed F-104 starfighters. Tanaka was said to have been paid as much as $14 million by Lockheed, although when he was arrested, the indictment was only for accepting $2 million. The Tanaka aide testified that his boss probably was unaware of the Lockheed bribe because it was so paltry. But it wasn't really $2 million. The trial lasted 7 years. And Tanaka spent $8 million on his defense. He retained control of the M Fund during the entire time. You just can't make this shit up. Oversaw the appointment of 3 prime ministers and was returned to the Diet for the 15th time while under investigation. That actually tops crap that goes on here. I'm sorry. As the trial dragged on, the first signs of defection from the ranks was Prime Minister Nakasone, a leader of the Liberal Democratic Party to the extreme segment of their party, begged Tanaka to resign from the party. Nakasone's disloyalty alarmed Tanaka, and he began to worry that other members might join that club, taking their billions of dollars in bonds with them. Aside from the hardcore club members, there was a second tier of rich men on the perimeter of the club whose loyalty to Tanaka was not as airtight as the original group. So several of them tried to redeem their bonds simultaneously. If they did, they would be caught with their pants down. So Tanaka and his clique had to thoroughly plunder the national treasury of the Ministry of Finance to be able to make sure they could keep all their balls in the air. A sinking fund is a special reserve account created by a government when it issues bonds. The government is obligated to put money into that sinking fund at regular intervals in order to be able to redeem the bonds when they become due. If several of Tanaka's disloyal bondholders insisted on redeeming their bonds, the Ministry of Finance did not have sufficient funds because they weren't doing that. Rather than cover the exposure by dipping into the M Fund or into his own private Bank of Japan, Tanaka and his clever associates at the Ministry of Finance came up with a very unique way to work around this. They would roll over the original Japanese government bonds by exchanging them for new financial instruments called certificates of redemption. These were not the ministry's usual bonds, but a form of debt instrument or an IOU, specially designed, printed, and issued by the Ministry of Finance. So that they were called 57s because they were issued in the 57th year of Hirohito's reign to distinguish them as different from regular government bonds. The bondholders who already were owed outstanding interest would be given specially designed and printed cashier's checks from the bank, serving as the ministry's conduit for interest payments. Because many of the bondholders were considered politically untrustworthy, they were given no choice in the matter and simply were told the ministry was doing it whether they liked it or not. Already the M Fund appeared to have led to the death of Kashi's brother, Prime Minister Sato. Many Japanese believe Sato was poisoned in 1975 at the height of the contest with Tanaka for control of the M Fund. The number of others associated with Sato in the M Fund financing was Fuji Steel, who also died mysteriously in the 1970s. A major scandal over Sato's death was avoided when Tanaka paid Sato's widow about 300 billion yen from the M Fund. In 1984, Harvey Fukuda, who was the publisher and business partner of Kodama, who knew where all of the skeletons were hidden, mysteriously died of a heart attack in the hospital. Huh. So he had expressed fear that he was going to be poisoned, but his family members didn't believe him. The next assisted suicide was Prime Minister Takeshida's personal assistant, who knew too much about the 57s. According to the Wall Street Journal, he slit his wrist, legs, and neck, and when that failed, he hung himself with a necktie on a curtain rod. What? That sounds like Mark Middleton. That sounds almost just like Mark Middleton. Basically, the 57s were unlike anything previously issued by the government of Japan. They were not offered to the public at large, nor were they traded on the international bond market like normal government bonds. So only the holders actually saw them. The magic of the scheme is that by their very difference, it was possible for the Ministry of Finance later to declare all 57s to be forgeries, so they didn't have to honor any of them. Only certain ones were then selectively and very secretively renegotiated at a discount. Those who paid for the original government bonds and then were forced to exchange them for the 57s were swindled twice. Washington has backed Tokyo's assertion that the 57s are counterfeit. So let me, this is kind of important. So I want to tell you basically how they did this, because there's a long explanation here, but it's a real short explanation. Basically, they issued these things and they intentionally put some errors, like spelling errors. There'd be like, there's a number on them, like a registered number, and then there's verbiage on them. And they would intentionally, based on the numbers, misspell like the fifth word. And then the next number, and they had a register that was later discovered that each of the numbered and what the error was, so they would know whether or not it was the real one. And for some people that they liked, when those were presented, they would negotiate the redemption of them. And then others that they didn't want to have to honor, that was on that lower tier that he didn't think was as loyal as some of the others, they just claimed they were forgeries. And because it was all done in secrecy, no one knew there was a master log of who all had them. And so Japan just basically told the US, we don't know anything about them. Those are forgeries. But they did redeem some that were their buddies at a discount, because they would basically tell those people, you either take this or you get nothing, because we're going to tell you it's a forgery. That's how maniacally evil this Japanese government that still exists today is. And they were all in on it. They all operate like this. Everybody in Japan. It is one of the most inherently dishonest, evil governments that there is out there as far as swindling the Japanese people. It's crazy. So, Tanaka ends up having a stroke in 1985, and they tried to hide his condition because there was a big argument over who was going to get control of the M Fund. And Nakasone saw himself and the far-right Liberal Democrat Party as the natural heir. Gotoda and Kanemaru tried to elbow Nakasone aside, bringing Takeshita in to strengthen kind of their so you've got this guy over here, he believes he's the natural because he's in charge of the party, he should get control of the fund. And then these guys keep getting buddies on it, and they're going to gang up on this guy over here. As this struggle got underway, wealthy Japanese decided at that moment that they were going to basically make a run to cash in their 57s because they see the handwriting on the wall that things are going to get real dicey here. And that's basically when they found out. And there's a bank over there called the Daiichi, DAI-ICHI, that got involved in the redemption of all of those bonds. And that became a huge fiasco over what they were going to do with them. So basically, there's a guy that got involved in the whole thing, Norbert, SCHLEI, Schley. And he basically is another Korean. Let's see. He was, no, I'm sorry. So let me get him straight. He's an American, and he's living in Los Angeles. But in 1962, he was appointed the Assistant Attorney General of the U.S. by President Kennedy, and he was a deputy, to Robert Kennedy. He had spent some time in the Army or in the Navy as a Korean War veteran. So he basically was kind of tasked to look into all of the stuff that was going on over there. He became involved with the M Fund and the 57s, not knowing anything about what was going on, and agreed to make an inquiry based on Asian clients of his California law firm. Just was going to see what was going on. So some of his constituents or his clients have some of them, and they're trying to redeem them, and they can't get them redeemed. And so they go to him because he's part of the DOJ and ask, once he becomes the DOJ, ask them to look into him. So he leaves the DOJ and then continues to work on some of the people that had brought this to attention while he was in the DOJ. So he basically, his customers tell him that they had held the normal government bonds, and then they were forced to give them up and get these 57s and these checks that were issued by the bank, that Daiichi Bank, and they were deliberately printed to look unusual, so they could then tell them that they were fraudulent. So they asked them to look into persuading the government of Japan to redeem their certificates. So bringing in a law firm of Hughes, Hubert, and Reed, they hoped to put pressure on the Ministry of Finance and the bank that they might agree to an out-of-court settlement or risk a public scandal. And they really don't like that at all. So as he began to make his inquiries, he provoked an extraordinary reaction from an unexpected quarter, the U.S. government, which ultimately set out to destroy him and his reputation for taking on these clients. He was convinced, as many people on Wall Street were as well, that he became the victim of a sting operation that went out of control when Washington had to cover up its involvement in the M Fund and the black money politics of Japan. What happened to Schley reveals a breathtaking depth of deceit, a measure of what is being kept hidden. When Schley could not foresee what he could not foresee, were the extreme measurements the US government, in bed with the Japanese government, would do to anyone asking questions. He was surprised by his client's allegations that the Tanaka M Fund originally had been set up by General MacArthur with treasure looted from occupied countries, and that basically President Nixon had given it back to Japan. But Slay carried out his own due diligence. He became convinced that it was all true. His mistake was to assume that it was all in the distant past and that he could talk to American diplomats and bureaucrats about the anomaly today, back then. He realized he had intruded upon something still alive and very dangerous at the heart of darkness. So Takahashi was one, Takahashi, was one of his clients, while a student leader who had been given a 40 million yen, which was basically $500,000 worth of a bond in the M Fund, in checks laundered through a CIA front company called Committee for a Free Asia. So he was familiar with the history of the M Fund from its earliest days. This client was. More recently, he had become a member of the Tanaka Club and had bought several of Tanaka's bonds, but he was the lower level, not the one that was going to be allowed to redeem them. Now he was saying that he couldn't cash them in because they had all been labeled as counterfeit. So he realized he had been swindled and wanted help. So Slay went to Japan to investigate the story personally. He interviewed 20 witnesses with the aid of interpreters, reviewed records going back to the 1960s where leaders claimed that the 57s were fraudulent and the M Fund never existed. Slay saw enough evidence to conclude that they were all lying. The whole thing was set up so that if anybody tried to do anything with these instruments, this is a quote from him, the matter would be referred immediately to the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance was likely able to stop the transactions or authorize it if it was one that the ministry wanted to authorize, unquote. Slay talked to the U.S. government officials in a position to know, including Ambassador Mike Mansfield, CIA General Counsel Stanley Sporkin, and President Reagan's National Security Advisor, Richard Allen. Mansfield's embassy aides scoffed at any suggestion that Washington made covert payments to the Liberal Democrat Party. And let me just tell you, that's why I'm convinced that everybody in our embassies are CIA, not just the CIA contingent. No one warned Slay that he was on extremely thin ice with his own government. Slay told Sporkin explicitly that he was going to try to negotiate these instruments in Japan and wanted to make sure the CIA had no objection. After looking into the matter overnight, Sporkin told Slay he found the whole story extraordinary, but that the agency had no interest in the proposed sale of the instruments because it was a private matter. This was a very strange thing for Sporkin to say, and it can only be understood in light of what followed. Although Sporkin may have had no immediate personal knowledge of 57s or the M Fund, which I doubt, he must have asked CIA officers who knew all about them, including the CIA station chief in Tokyo. The CIA officers naturally would be determined to keep it a secret, but by responding that as they did, they set in motion a process of entrapment, whether deliberately or otherwise. Washington's manipulation of the Japanese political process during the Allied occupation and its evolution over more than 50 years since is not merely historically significant, but it's actually very deadly. When Slay returned to Japan to press his client's claim, the Liberal Democrat Party bosses complained to the U.S. Embassy. Without Slay's knowledge, several of his clients in America then were approached by U.S. Treasury agents who urged them to offer their 57s for sale in the US, which was illegal because they had already deemed them counterfeit. Whoever offered to buy them would be arrested and their 57s seized. As their attorney, Slay then could be drawn into a co-conspirator relationship and prosecuted until Washington turned the full force of their ire on Slay in 1992. The target of the U.S. sting was an elderly invalid woman by the name of Barbara Jean Bravender, Ahloo. She has a long name. Ahloo. Must be, she must have married somebody that's from Japan. So she lived in Los Angeles on Social Security of less than $1,000 a month. A U.S. citizen, she had married a Hawaiian Chinese businessman named Ahloo. That makes sense. And spent long periods of with him in Hong Kong running a business called Transfield Investments. Transfield had been approached by Japanese client, including Takahashi, looking for help in redeeming their 57s. Initial efforts by Transfield failed when the Bank of Japan took the position that they were all fraudulent. During this period, Mrs. Ahloo met Craig Ivester, a bounty hunter employed by Bank Corp International as a finder of commodity transactions. They discussed the 57s, and Ivester sent a photocopy of one to Union Bank Swiss, UBS, which replied automatically that it was fraudulent without even bothering to examine the original. Aging and seriously ill, Mrs. Ahloo then returned by herself to Los Angeles and was living in a single room borrowed from a terminally ill friend in a house facing foreclosure when she again encountered the bounty hunter. At this point, Craig Ivester was making his living as a U.S. Customs Service informer, looking for targets. So Ivester decided to persuade Mrs. Ahloo to offer some 57s for sale inside the United States, which he knew was illegal, earning him a finder's fee for the customs people to turn her in. Sick as she was, Mrs. Ahloo still had gumption. She told Ivester she would never negotiate a 57 in the U.S. Ivester approached the Customs Service and offered then to entrap Mrs. Ahloo by baiting her with the offer of a very large commission. According to Slay's investigators, the sting operation was mounted by the U.S. Secret Service, Jack Fox, because you know the Secret Service does money laundering and stuff like that. Forgery, what's the other thing? Counterfeit. So you had Jack Fox, who is a Secret Service person, and Customs Service agents Michael Sankey and Michael Noonan. So acting on a tip from Ivester, their plan was to offer Mrs. Ahloo a big commission to coax her into selling her 57s inside the U.S. And then they were going to arrest her, and they would be able to arrest her lawyer because he would be in collusion with her. So Fox got credentials showing that he was the vice president of the First National Bank of Chicago. Sankey would pretend to be a rich businessman. They rented a room in Reno that they had wired and asked her to come for a meeting. If they could get her to cross a state line, it would be construed as a federal offense rather than a state one. Mrs. Ahloo could not come because she could not afford the airline ticket. The Secret Service sent her a free round-trip ticket. You talk about entrapment. The first concrete step in their plan. When she got to Reno, she said she was sorry, but she could not obtain any 57s. Anyway, she said the Japanese government claimed they were fraudulent and the people had gone to jail for selling these bonds. Fox, Sankey, and Noonan persisted, browbeating her until finally she said that she would try to get a 57, but only if they could arrange a proper legitimate transaction through a leading American securities firm, a firm that would make sure all laws were observed and no one got in trouble. Secret Service agent Fox promised to bring Smith Marney into the deal. He faxed Mrs. Ahloo a letter purporting to be from a Smith Barney vice president, offering to purchase 357s. For the sting to work, it had to happen in a jurisdiction where there was a Smith Barney office and a compliant judge. They decided to lure Mrs. Alou to Tampa, Florida, where Smith Barney had an office and where the U.S. attorney expected federal district court judge Elizabeth Kovacevic to be cooperative. Do you see how they court shop? This has been going on for ages. This is not anything new. So eventually, Mrs. Alou heard about Roger Hill, a broker who had some of the 57s in his possession, hoping to find a potential buyer. But on the eve of the trip to Tampa, she suffered a heart attack and asked her son, Bruce Hansberry, to go with Roger Hill in her place to conclude the deal at Smith Barney. When they arrived in Tampa, they were arrested. Because she was not present, they had to rope her in by getting her on the telephone to discuss the closing so that she could be arrested in Los Angeles. This was done and she was taken into custody on the pretext that her early residence in Hong Kong meant that she might try to flee the country. They put her in prison to await trial. Ultimately was convicted of conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and security fraud. Mrs. Alou began to lose her mind and was moved to a prison psychiatric ward where she was found to have had cancer of the throat and died. These people are bastards, I'm telling you. By January 1992, 16 offices of the Secret Service were said to be involved in the Alou sting. Mrs. Alou was too insignificant to justify such an expenditure of taxpayer money, so the vigilantes looked for someone else to lynch. One possibility was Takahashi, to whom the 57s belonged, but when they broke into his Los Angeles apartment, it was empty, and he was out of the country and hiding. Trophy hunting was becoming a feature of American criminal justice system. Takahashi was not famous, so he was not a proper trophy for the ambitious U.S. attorney. Norbert Slay, on the other hand, of the prestigious law firm, was definitely going to be a trophy. His high profile made him the perfect target. Slay had written a memo about the M Fund. It was not meant for general circulation, but a copy was passed to the U.S. government official who became alarmed and angry. If they could ensnare Slay, all branches of the U.S. government would cooperate to stop his digging into the M Fund and the leadership in Tokyo. Slay had never tried to negotiate a 57 in America, only in Japan, on behalf of clients legally entitled to have their attorney make inquiries. Slay had never accepted a penny from any of these clients, but Takahashi was so impatient to sell one of his 57s that he had taken several of them back from Slay and, without telling him, turned them over to Roger Hill to market. It was quite a stretch to argue that Slay had anything to do with that, trying to sell them by Roger Hill, because he didn't even know they were gone. The government could try to get Slay indicted as a party to the conspiracy of Alou, Hansberry, and Hill, because he happened to be Takahashi's attorney and was admittedly trying to negotiate other 57s in Japan. It would be absurd to assert that Slay was involved in the Tampa transaction, but that could be covered by a little sleight of hands, misdirection, and the jury may not notice. Finally, when Slay freely acknowledged that the Japanese government regarded the 57s as counterfeit, it could be argued that he was admitting marketing certificates he knew to be fraud. This dodged the circumstantial point, which Slay stated again and again, that he was convinced the Japanese government was lying to avoid having to redeem them. Slay would depend on a trophy hunting prosecutor, a compliant judge, a misdirected jury, and a coordinated effort by Washington to block his effort at discovery, denial by the court of leave for Slay to take depositions in Japan, intimidation of defense witnesses, and expert prosecution witnesses brought in from Japan, but they wouldn't let him go. who had been coached and evasive on their testimony. Astonished to be named as a party to the Alu deal, of which he had not even been aware, Slay found himself the subject of a grand jury proceeding in Tampa and was indicted. Immediately, clients holding 57 scattered to avoid being drawn in. If cornered, became so frightened that they offered to testify against Slay in return for immunity from prosecution. This is the U.S. government. It is a criminal syndicate. It is not a government anymore. The prosecution proved the certificates were fake by bringing in two minor officials from the Japan's Ministry of Finance and the bank who had a vested interest in sticking to the story. Slay's defense countered corrupt Japanese officials were now falsely claiming these financial instruments were not genuine. Professor Lassiere insisted that they were genuine, as quoted earlier. Quote, the documents are so precisely in agreement in innumerable respects with the official published records of the government of Japan that, in my opinion, it is impossible for them to be fraudulent, unquote. To demonstrate collusion between Tokyo and Washington, the defense attempted to locate any report or document showing covert payments by the U.S. to Japan and any political party in Japan from 1945 to present. This has been confirmed by a number of sources, including former CIA officials and U.S. diplomats. But fighting for his life, Slay needed all of the documentary evidence available. He was certain that he would find these documents. Slay's legal right to have such discovery was evident, but federal agencies flatly refused to comply. News stories about the M Fund in the 57s obliged the court to order the CIA, Secret Service, National Archives, and State Department to conduct a search of their databases. Given the intense secrecy surrounding the Black Eagle Fund, the 1951 Peace Treaty, the M Fund, and the disappearance of millions of documents concerning Japan, it would have been a great surprise if anything turned up. The jury was told the search of records of the CIA, Secret Service, National Archives did not disclose any relevant information, and that the CIA gave money to employees or officials of the government, that the CIA gave them any money, or to any political party. The court record says the government searched hundreds of files in the CIA paper records dating back to 1948 for any document in which the CIA gave the Japanese government, the Liberal Democrat Party, or individual party members money directly. Searches for Marquardt Fund, which is the M Fund, did not discover any related documents. The jury was not told that the acting CIA director, William Studerman, had informed the New York Times in March of 1995 that the CIA was not about to divulge information on the subject of the payola to federal foreign governments and politicos. Studerman said the agency had an obligation to keep faith with politicians who received legally authorized covert support from the United States. This statement actually confirms that such payments are made and merely refuses to give the details. Japanese politicians were bribed with huge sums of money and were protected by the U.S. government. Slay told the court, I figured that if the Iran-Contra case, people like Ollie North and Admiral Poindexter and McFarlane could be doing things and lying about it, then maybe people in the Japanese government could also be lying about some of the things they do. Judge Kovacic refused Slay the right to take depositions in Japan and brushed aside Slay's protest that a key defense witness had been intimidated by the U.S. attorney. His attorneys alleged that the prosecution tampered with the witness, S.M. Hahn, H-A-N, who had an immunity agreement with the U.S. attorney, Mark Crum. Hahn swore that Crum told him that if he testified for the defense, his immunity agreement would be nullified. Hahn also said Crum told him that he better not give him any basis to withdraw the immunity because he would not hesitate to do so. Witness tampering is one of the most serious crimes in the U.S. judicial system and grounds for disbarment. but the judge denied the motion for a new trial based on the charge of witness tampering and even refused to hold an evidentiary hearing to determine whether or not it was true. After 6 years of prosecution, Slay was convicted on one felony count of security fraud and one misdemeanor. Before the trial began, he had assets in the neighborhood of about $10 million. During his trial, he was able to practice law and had enormous legal costs. He was professionally and financially ruined, left virtually bankrupt. He estimated the U.S. government spent over $45 million prosecuting him. Slay appealed, and in December 1997, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed and vacated the conviction on the felony count and the misdemeanor, reprimanding the misdemeanor to the district court for a hearing on Slay's motion for a new trial. Based on government intimidation of witnesses, the three appeals courts paid special attention to the way Kovacevich had handled the witness tampering issue. In their decision, they wrote that the transactions leading to Slay's indictment were unusual, if not bizarre. That's a quote. They found the judge's handling of the witness tampering enigmatic. And this is a quote. We cannot determine whether Slay was deprived of his right to due process because the judge did not conduct an evidentiary hearing where defendants present evidence to the district court and the government intimidated a defense witness. A trial court must grant a hearing to determine whether the allegations of intimidation are true, unquote. So a case that could be contrived to start and drag on for 6 years, resulting in his complete ruin, was overturned, still insisting on his innocence. He asked for a retrial, but the government knew he was broke, nearly 70, and in no position to fight indefinitely to clear his name. He finally agreed not to press his charges of witness tampering, leaving the minor misdemeanor charge unresolved. In Washington, to this day, he is slandered. The enigmatic libel a lawyer who should know better recently insisted that Slay's evidence was untrustworthy because he was a convicted felon. Others declared Slay's unresolved misdemeanor conviction amounted to moral turpitude. It took further wrangling with the California bar to have this smear removed from the official record. In January 2001, they announced Slay was once again an attorney in good standing, but the harm had been done. And in the spring of 2002, while jogging on the California beach, he suffered a major heart attack, collapsed, hit his head. A homeless man nearby called for help, but he remained in a coma for many months. The last time we saw him, he told us, quote, "I know now how and why the jury convicted me. Until I figured that out, I was a very troubled man," unquote. Other events unfolding in January 1992 may have led directly to his prosecution. He was not the only target in the M-Fund sting. Also arrested was a guy by the name of James Sena, S-E-N-A, a 17-year veteran of the U.S. Secret Service. The agency had also investigated counterfeiting for the Treasury Department. Sena had examined M-Fund financial instruments in America and Japan, where he became convinced of the legitimacy of the 57s. He decided to sell some himself. He and Ian Yorkshire of Great Britain and Francis Chong of Hong Kong were all arrested for attempting to market 57s with a total face value of $50 billion. Abruptly and for no apparent reason in 1995, the case against them was suddenly dismissed with prejudice, meaning the charges cannot be refiled. Nevertheless, prosecutors refused to turn the 57s they had confiscated as evidence, calling them contraband. If counterfeit, why were they contraband? We were told by the Wall Street source that the Treasury is eager to get their hands on all of the 57s and other supposedly counterfeit derivatives to negotiate with them separately. Another prominent American who reportedly became involved in negotiating 57s during the same period was a former Secretary of State, General Alexander Haig. Unlike Slay, Haig was not arrested or prosecuted. demonstrating just how selective Washington was in selecting targets. Haig was asked to intercede on behalf of Paraguay. Paraguay? Isn't that where Bush has a ranch? The government of Paraguay had bought a single 57 with a face value of $500 million from First Hanover Securities in New York City in November 1991. 91? Huh. 1991. That's when we went to war with Iraq. At the very moment of the sting, when Mrs. Alu was going down, the same day, Paraguay asked MIC Debt Readjustment Company to arrange for the Japanese government to redeem this 57, not for cash, but for credit against a $40 billion foreign aid that Paraguay owed to Tokyo. This represented 80% of the face value of the 57, and Tokyo could keep the other 20% as a discount. MIC is an organization backed by the Israeli government, which negotiates adjustments of national debt for governments in Eastern Europe and South America. Isn't that convenient? If successful, MIC was to be given an oil exploration and development rights on Paraguay territory after considering former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former Ambassador Mike Mansfield. MIC chose Haig as their negotiator. He was a good choice. Haig knew Japan because of the 1947 fresh out of West Point. He was an aide to General MacArthur in Tokyo. He knew all about all of this. The general recalled 1951 as MacArthur's aide, working in a tight circle of men like Whitney and Willoughby. Haig doubtlessly heard a lot of the black ops and secret funds set up in Tokyo. While in Japan, Haig married the daughter of General Alonzo Patrick Fox, MacArthur's deputy chief of staff. Haig later served President Nixon as a national security staff, White House chief of staff for Nixon and Ford, and Secretary of State for President Reagan. At a strategy meeting in Miami, MIC and the Paraguayans asked Haig to negotiate personally with former Japanese Prime Minister Takeshita, a key man in the M Fund and one of the Liberal Democrat Party kingmakers. After being embarrassed by bribery scandals, including the recruit scandal involving the M Fund kickbacks and war loot, Takeshita had been forced to resign as prime minister 2 years earlier in 1989, but he remained powerful. Haig agreed to meet with Takeshita in Tokyo. He reportedly told the Miami Roundtable that the 57 should be negotiated underground as quickly as possible. So Haig had discussions in Washington with the FBI and CIA, much like Schley had done. One of the CIA officials explained that Japan had a number of secret funds, including what he called the MacArthur Fund, apparently referring to the Sanwa Bank joint account in the name of MacArthur and Hirohito, which Japanese called the Showa Fund, referring to the reign title of Hirohito. He also explained that the Japanese government bonds had evolved into 57s. Our source said Haig also paid a visit to the White House to tell President Bush of his forthcoming meeting with Takeshita to negotiate 57s for Paraguay. Explaining the give and take involved, he asked Bush for his support to ease the way. Our source said Bush gave Haig a personal letter to take to Takeshita. President Bush was on his way to Japan himself in January. He was in Tokyo a few days before Haig, a visit made famous when Bush vomited all over Prime Minister Miyazawa. That's nice. I remember that. On January 1992, Haig was informed that 2 weeks later, he was to be the guest of honor at a lunch at Tokyo's Imperial Hotel with the Liberal Democrat Party Diet Committee, like their DNC, if you will, after which he and Takeshita were to have a private talk in a room. MIC said Takeshita would probably start by saying that all 57s were counterfeit. Haig had to be prepared for this and be ready to say 2 or 3 things that would jolt Takeshita. He asked MIC to choose the 3 most impressive supporting documents to show Takeshita. One of these was an insurance policy issued by the Yasuta Fire Insurance Company in Tokyo to cover transporting the certificates from the Ministry of Finance. This alone established the authenticity of the 57s. MIC briefed Haig in detail about the significance of these supporting documents and reviewed the differences between 57s and ordinary government bonds. Shortly before the meeting, Haig was told that Takeshita had been acutely embarrassed by a recent series of major scandals, so that the Liberal Democrat Party leader hoped to get from Haig was a promise to stop Japan bashing in America. If Takeshita would come out of their meeting with such an assurance, he might survive the scandals and resume power. The 2 men sat down privately at 2:40 p.m. One source said Takeshita opened as predicted, asking Haig to get U.S. companies and politicians to stop Japan bashing. Haig replied positively, handling Takeshita the personal letter from President Bush. Takeshita then said that any agreement on settling Paraguay's debt to Japan would have to include Japanese participation in developing oil fields in the country. With that on the table, Haig explained that one of the main reasons for his visit was to get Takeshita's assurances that Paraguay's 57 would be credited against its foreign aid. Mr. Haig, he responds, this paper is a forgery printed in Hong Kong. Haig then responds, then please take a look at these documents. And he handed Takeshita the insurance cover document and 2 others. Reading each document, Takeshita's face turned pale and his voice faint. Mr. Haig, it seems to include a very delicate problem for the settlement. Yes, Mr. Haig said, I agree, it's delicate. I cannot give you an immediate reply. The meeting ended, and minutes later, Haig reported all of this to the MIC group in his suite. He said that it was only when he saw Takeshita's recoil and shock at the sight of the insurance cover that he realized how serious the secrecy was surrounding these 57s. Our source said Haig turned angrily to the Paraguayans and said, you're making me blackmail him. He then grinned and said, the first missile hit the target. He warned that Paraguayans and Israelis to be very careful about their personal safety while they're in Japan because Takeshita was not happy and he would certainly alert their Secret Service. The next day, Takeshita's personal secretary came to see Haig, insisting on talking in the hallway where they could not be monitored. He said, Mr. Haig, the certificate and documents are not formal, so our government cannot repurchase it. Haig squinted at him and said, so we can make it public? Takeshita's secretary turned pale. He said that he would speak again to Takeshita. The second missile had also hit home, according to Haig. Takeshita's secretary came again. As for the problem of the certificate, many inquiries are coming to our Ministry of Finance, locally and overseas, and the administration is greatly perplexed. We are ready to take certain measures on the certificate in question. We must treat this negotiation as strictly confidential. If a similar demand is made by another government, our administration would suffer because we are not prepared for it financially. In short, Haig had succeeded and the deal went down. But how could Haig negotiate a 57 in Miami, Washington, Tokyo, with discussions at the FBI, CIA, President Bush at the White House without being arrested or prosecuted like Norbert Shea? Federal agents always insisted it was illegal to negotiate on one inside America or even to contemplate it. If all 57s are counterfeit, why did Haig succeed? If Haig's 57 was genuine, why did he still do something illegal? Does the legitimacy of the Japanese debt instrument depend on your connections to the current occupant in the White House? Slay was drawn into the sting soon after Haig's Tokyo negotiation concluded. One of Takashito's conditions after ending the Japan bashing may have been that Schley, who was asking so many embarrassing questions, must be silenced or removed from the play. If so, Haig certainly would have reported this to President Bush, which was likely explain why Slate had been drugged into the Alu case. There is a lesson here for investors. There are many elements of the Black Eagle Trust that continue to float around on the global market as a magnetic mine left over from World War II that can blow up and sink any institution or individual that comes in contact with them. While they are necessarily legitimate, having them basically can end you up in jail. I do think that I probably at the end of this will go back and make a post about this because this is so relevant to our judicial system today. And it basically illustrates what we're going through right now with even with the prosecution of Trump. This is not unprecedented. This stuff has happened. What is unprecedented is how it's all being exposed. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. And I think that's what we have to take away from all of this. Our government's been sick for a very long time. And it, to me, is refreshing to know that it's all being revealed in real time, which means something drastically has changed. So, let me go back and look at some of y'all's awesome comments. I love the fact when y'all come in here and you talk to each other. I absolutely love it. At the beginning, Ike started his own version of the OSS, then took over the CIA for his own purposes. Yeah, actually, General Eisenhower, from Truman, who did away with the OSS, there was two entities. One was like the CIG, like the Central Intelligence Group, and then there was another one, and then the CIA. They were just iterations of the same entity of the OSS, as you point out, to keep the people employed. And anybody that didn't fold directly into these transitional ones were basically put in the service, like in the Defense Department, kind of to park them there. And some of the intelligence agencies that came about at the end of World War II, to park them there until they got the CIA up and running. And they also created front companies and parked them there. Let's see. We accept hall passes for being late. Love that Montana's here. Let's see. Groovy Cowgirl. Tara's here. SR71. Love that you're here. Let's see. Yeah, it is like the bearer bonds. There's several different iterations of this that has gone on. And if you get caught with them and they don't want to deal with you, you're going down. Let's see. That will show respect. Yeah, thank you, Minnesota Patriot, for reminding everybody to hit the thumbs up if you would. It helps us move up in the rankings on Rumble for search. And also follow us if you haven't already followed us. I really appreciate that. Oh, and Steve, thank you for putting that link out there. I appreciate it. I don't have my Bridget and they're working on something else really important at the moment. And Liza, Bernie Madoff. Yeah, exactly. This puts Bernie Madoff to shame. Let me tell you, he looks like a kindergartner compared to these guys. Let's see. Yeah, America's not been free for a long time. I'd say not since 1913 when they stood up the Fed. And there were fits back and forth even before that, but definitely not since then. Yeah, there was not SR 71 as far as the judge goes. I looked her up. Nothing ever happened to her. And it is a crock of bullshit. Um, yep, just like that. Haig was a dirty, dirty, dirty. Oh, and by the way, just so that y'all will know this, um, just in case you didn't know this, Gateway Pundit published an article of another letter that was submitted as part of one of the Trump's lawsuits against Trump that's signed by a bunch of generals and admirals and a few defense people. A couple of those people I actually know. And I did a little research project this afternoon that as soon as we get done here, I'm going to post. And we're going to, oh, look at you, SR71. Thank you for giving us that donation to buy our book. We are definitely going to buy the book. I am still waiting till tomorrow morning before I hit send on the purchase. It's $150 for the book, and thank you for contributing $25 towards this purchase. I really, really appreciate that, because I really need to get these. I'm hoping that I think it's going to come to us in a PDF that I could then share with Bridget and Liza, so we can get the information out to you as quickly as possible. And if all three of us work on it, it'll be number one, it'll be a better product. Number two, it'll come out a lot faster. So thank you for helping us along with that endeavor. I really appreciate it. Boy, the roots run deep. Yes, they do. So it's one more chance at redemption of the bonds. So if you know General Haig, you can get your bonds redeemed. If you don't, you're screwed. Let's see. Love your site. Thank you, Gothier. I appreciate that. It's a wonder the Japanese people want anything to do with the U.S. at all. And I don't know how much of all of this they even know too. I mean, I think a lot of them are like us. We sat around thinking our government was good. Now we know different. Optics, like in Korea, the ordinary citizens understand our plight, and because Donnie Vision, exactly. That's exactly what I think. Mike Key, I smashed that like button just like I smashed my, oh, what the heck? What's that? Yeah, I don't need that garbage. What is the book you were having a hard time finding? Steve, let me look that up for you real quick. I will tell you what the name of it is. Probably the best place I can find it is this email. Hold on just a second. Because I've emailed about it a couple of times today. Okay, it is called, where's my title? The Incubus, INCUBUS of Intervention, Conflicting Indonesian Strategies of JFK and Allen Dulles. So basically, you can't even, and this is serious. You can't even listen to the podcast of this guy. We found a podcast that talks about this, and the podcast, shoot, I lost y'all. Hold on a second. I gotta find which. I got too many browsers open. The podcast that was about his book also came back like the 401 error, where you can't even listen to the broadcast. So that's just crazy as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, I got to find y'all. I lost my tab. My daughter's, I can hear her laughing in the background right now because I keep way too many tabs open and now I can't find my dash on it with your comments. So hold on just a second. Let me find it. You got me sidetracked. I should have known not to leave my position here. Hold on just a second. So I can get back to my comments. Shoot, y'all might be lost all night. Anyway, that's all I've got. I am going to log off here so I find my window. And I want to get that post out. So please be looking for that on X, and I'll try to get it over on True Social as well. I do a little paragraph on each one of those bastards that have participated in the scam against General Trump, President Trump, and I call every one of them out. And there's a few General Haggs on the list. So I just want to put that out there for y'all, and you can go look up what bad little I'm not going to use Liza's word that she calls them, but anyway, they're bad guys. So I will get that out to you guys, and just be looking for it. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. Oh, there it is. Shoot. All right, Donnie Vision. I found one book seller in Malaysia that had 2 copies. I've been having difficult. Yeah. So that's the same thing, Donnie Vision. Thank you for saying that. I did get on there, but it won't let me. It doesn't give you a shipping because they have free shipping. So they probably don't want to ship to the United States. And when you put that address in, it leaves it blank. So there's no place that you can select what you're shipping. I'd pay the shipping. I just want the book, but they won't let us do it. So I talked to Zach from Red Pill yesterday. He said he would get a hold of you ASAP. All right. Well, hopefully we're having a Badlands fan club meeting this Saturday at a local venue here. If any of you guys live in Central Florida and you want to come, just DM me on True Social or Twitter or on X, and I'll get you the information. There's going to be a lot of people. I think Red Pill's going to be there. I don't know if CanCon's coming. I think Stormy Patriot Joe will be there. General Quatst, who is a neighbor of mine, he's going to be there. And then I'll be there. And we had about 35 people the last time. It was a lot of fun. Put some clothes on. I have one of those rompers on. It just doesn't have any y'all are so funny. So I'm sitting here looking at myself and I'm like, gosh, that does look weird, doesn't it? Maybe I should just pull this up around my neck. I love you guys to death. That's so funny. I don't have a bathing suit on. I would never sit here and do this in my bathing suit. Besides that, my bathing suit all has straps. That's hilarious. You guys are all so awesome. You know what? That's a good idea. I might be able, I do have a VPN. I'll look and see, because I would love to be able to play the video for you guys on one of our podcasts if I can get it to work. Basically, I can just give you the cheat sheet of what we're finding out, because right now we're doing our deep dive into Southeast Asia. We have found that, so this particular book is about Indonesia. We've cooed their government at least once, if not twice. Why I think it's so important is because I want y'all to know what the huge CIA presence was in Indonesia. Because do you know the period of time that we're talking about is when Barack Obama's stepfather was working for the CIA in Indonesia. And I've got a feeling that there is a huge connection between the two. So as soon as we found this guy, we listened to his podcast about his other book, which you can get. And he basically makes the case that the overthrow of the Indonesian government was by the CIA. Um, and so I really want to get my hands on the one that draws the correlation to JFK. Because think about this, Barack Obama is my age. He was born in 1961. We are talking about Kennedy coming to power, being elected in 1960, took office in 61, and he was obviously murdered in 63. This guy makes the connection that this was yet another. We already know that there was Algeria, that the CIA disagreed. The CIA actually had Operation Gladio units in Algeria fighting with the people that the OAS that disagreed with France in freeing Algeria. So they were fighting against their own country, trying to keep people enslaved. And the CIA wanted to keep them enslaved as well, and went against Kennedy's working with Charles de Gaulle, the French president, to free Algeria. Then we also know the Lumumba crisis. We also know the Cuba crisis. So you can start seeing we're marching across the world that Kennedy was on the right side of everything. The CIA was fighting him every step of the way. So as soon as I saw the dates on what happened in Indonesia and then know the Barack Obama connection to it, I have to have that book. We're going to get that book. So anyway, let's see. What'd you get, Steve? Library. Yeah, see, this is the one I have, the JFK versus Allen Dulles Battleground Indonesia. That is a book, and there's a podcast with that book. We've got that, and I've listened to that podcast. The one we can't find is the one that has that weird name that I read off to you. That's the one that I can't get to play. And yeah, I can get that one that you just put up there, that link. I can get that one to play. I can't get the other one to play. So I will go post the link on my X account of the one I can't get to play. So y'all that have a VPN, you can give me a second opinion. And we'll go from there. When Kennedy was assassinated, I was in Marine Corps boot camp in San Diego. Oh my gosh. So my uncle, Walt Wooden, Wooden, Alzheimer. I think that's old timer kind of. So my uncle Walt Wooden would have been at the Camp Pendleton around that same time. So he served out there for 4 to 6 years, actually was assigned to Camp Pendleton. And then when he got off active duty, he married a local girl there and lived there his whole life. When I was stationed at Los Angeles Air Force Base, they lived down in San Diego, like in Escondido. And I used to drive down there every long weekend, spend all the holidays with them. My Aunt Grace is still alive. I lost my Uncle Walt several years ago, but absolutely loved him to death. And I love San Diego. It's a beautiful area. Okay, many eyes searching can help. I agree with that. So, all right. 25 months in Iraq altogether. I could tell you some stories about fraud, waste, and abuse. Oh, I bet you can. And drug smuggling. All right, guys. So that's it. I got to get that post out, get some shut-eye, and go up and try to get in tomorrow. So thank you, SR71, for the donation. Appreciate everybody's help in trying to find that book. You know where to find me on X and Truth Social. If you guys find anything, I appreciate you being here tonight, and I'll see you on Thursday night, if not sooner. Bye.